The winter of 1895 descended upon the San Juan Mountains of Colorado with a cruelty that seemed almost deliberate, as if nature herself had decided to punish those who dared to scrape gold from her frozen bones. The town of Silverbrook clung to the mountainside like a desperate prayer, a collection of wooden structures that groaned under the weight of ice and wind, populated by men and women who had traded warmth and certainty for the promise of fortune buried deep in the earth. It was a season that tested every soul who remained in those high places, where the air was so thin that simple exertion left men gasping, where temperatures plunged to depths that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, where the wind carried not just cold, but a kind of malice that seemed to seek out every crack and gap in a building's defenses. The snow came in waves, sometimes gently, sometimes in blinding storms that erased the world beyond a few feet of visibility. Between the storms, the sky would clear to a blue so deep and pure it seemed almost black, and the stars at night burned with an intensity that made them feel close enough to touch. Silverbrook had been founded 7 years earlier, in 1888, when a prospector named John Silver found a rich vein of ore running through the eastern face of the mountain. Within months, 1,000 people had flooded into the valley, bringing with them all the chaos and hope and desperation that followed every mining boom. Tents gave way to wooden shacks, which gave way to proper buildings, until a real town emerged from the wilderness, complete with a main street, churches, saloons, boarding houses, and all the infrastructure necessary to extract wealth from stone. By 1895, the initial frenzy had subsided. Many of the fortune seekers had moved on to newer strikes, leaving behind a core population of perhaps 300 souls who had committed to making Silverbrook their home. These were the people who had built businesses, started families, put down roots in that rocky soil. They were miners and merchants, doctors and teachers, prostitutes and preachers, all bound together by the shared experience of surviving in one of the harshest environments on the continent. The town stretched along a narrow shelf of relatively flat ground, with the mountain rising steeply behind it and a deep gorge falling away in front. A single road connected Silverbrook to the outside world, winding down through switchbacks and ravines to eventually reach Durango, some 40 miles to the south. In summer, freight wagons made the journey twice a week. In winter, if the snow was too deep or the wind too fierce, the town could be cut off for weeks at a time, forced to survive on whatever supplies had been laid in before the storms began. I was there when the mirror arrived. I saw what it showed us, and I am one of the few who survived to tell this story, though survival is perhaps too generous a word for what I have become since those dark days when we learned that some reflections show not what is, but what will be. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I kept the general store in Silverbrook. I was 32 years old that winter, a practical man who dealt in flour and pickaxes, tobacco, and lamp oil. I had no patience for superstition, no interest in the ghost stories that miners told around their stoves when the darkness pressed too close. I believed in ledgers and inventory, in the weight of silver coins and the texture of quality fabric. I believed in what I could touch and count and sell. I had come to Colorado in 1889, fleeing from Philadelphia and a life that had become unbearable. My father had been a merchant there, dealing in dry goods, and he had expected me to follow in his footsteps, to take over the business when he retired, to marry the daughter of one of his business associates and produce grandchildren to carry on the family name. But I had wanted something different, something that felt like mine rather than inherited. When news of the silver strikes in the San Juan Mountains reached the east, I saw my chance to escape, to build something with my own hands, to become someone other than my father's disappointing son. The journey west had been long and difficult, but also exhilarating. I felt like I was shedding my old self with every mile, leaving behind expectations and disappointments and the weight of a future I did not want. By the time I reached Silverbrook, I was ready to become Thomas Brennan, the shopkeeper, the practical man, the one who provided what others needed and asked nothing more from life than honest work and honest pay. I had built my store with my own money and my own labor, starting with a simple tent and gradually expanding to a proper wooden building with glass windows and shelves that held everything from canned peaches to dynamite. I slept in a small room above the shop, ate simple meals at the boarding house or cooked for myself on a small stove, and spent my evenings reading by lamplight or playing cards with other merchants. It was not a romantic life, but it was mine, and that had always been enough. I had no wife, no children, no close family connections. I had acquaintances rather than friends, business relationships rather than deep bonds. This suited me. I had learned early that attachment brought pain, that caring too much about people only led to disappointment and loss. Better to keep everyone at arm's length, to be friendly but not close, helpful but not involved. Better to be the shopkeeper who knew everyone's name but no one's secrets. This attitude, this deliberate isolation, may have saved my life when the mirror came. I had less to lose than most, less reason to look into a cursed glass and see what awaited me. I could observe the horror from a distance, could witness the unraveling without being consumed by it. Or so I told myself in the beginning, before I understood that no one could truly remain untouched by what the mirror revealed. The mirror came on the 15th of January, carried up the mountain road in a freight wagon driven by a man named Ezekiel Marsh. The wagon had struggled through snowdrifts that reached higher than a horse's belly, and Marsh himself looked half frozen when he finally pulled his team to a stop in front of the Silver Bell Hotel. His beard was white with frost, his eyes red from wind and cold, and when he climbed down from his seat, his movements were stiff and painful. I watched from the doorway of my store as Marsh and his assistant, a young Mexican man whose name I never learned, began to unload their cargo. It had been 3 days since any wagon had made it through from Durango, and the arrival of freight was always an event that drew attention. People emerged from buildings up and down the street, curious about what supplies had arrived, what letters or packages might be waiting for them. Marsh was a familiar figure on the mountain road, a man in his 50s who had been hauling goods between Durango and the mining camps for nearly 2 decades. He was known for his reliability and his willingness to attempt journeys that other drivers refused, pushing through weather that should have kept anyone sensible at home. He charged premium rates for winter deliveries, but he earned them through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to coax his teams through impossible conditions. On this particular day, he looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. As he climbed down from the wagon, he stumbled slightly, catching himself on the wheel, and I saw him wince as if in pain. His face, usually ruddy and animated, was gray beneath the frost, and there was something in his eyes that troubled me, a kind of haunted quality that spoke of more than simple physical exhaustion. The mirror was meant for Abigail Thornwood, the widow who owned the Silver Bell. She had ordered it from a dealer in Denver, a fine piece to grace the lobby of her establishment, something to remind her guests that even in this harsh place, civilization and refinement could still be found. The crate that contained it was large and heavy, bound with iron straps and stamped with markings I did not recognize, symbols that looked vaguely ecclesiastical but distorted, as if someone had tried to draw crosses and prayers from memory alone. These symbols would haunt me later, when I had time to think about them, when I tried to piece together where the mirror had come from and what dark path it had traveled to reach our town. They were not quite Christian, not quite anything I could identify. Some looked like Latin letters twisted into new shapes. Others resembled pictograms or runes, ancient marks from traditions I did not understand. At the time, I thought they were simply decorative, perhaps the manufacturer's attempt to make the shipping crate look important and valuable. But later, much later, I would wonder if they had been warnings, symbols meant to keep the mirror sealed and safe, protections that had been broken when we pried open the crate and released what lay inside. It took 4 men to carry the crate inside, and I was one of them. I remember the weight of it, far heavier than glass and wood should have been, and I remember the strange coldness that seemed to emanate from within, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. We set it down in the center of the lobby, and Abigail stood over it with her hands clasped together, her face bright with anticipation. She was a handsome woman, Abigail Thornwood, perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair she wore in a severe bun and eyes the color of slate. Her husband had died 3 years earlier in a mining accident, crushed when a tunnel collapsed, and she had taken his savings and built the Silver Bell into the finest hotel between Durango and Telluride. She ran it with an iron hand and a sharp mind, and she had no tolerance for drunkenness or disorder. The hotel was her pride, her monument to her own strength and determination. Abigail had come west with her husband in 1887, newly married, full of hope and ambition. James Thornwood had been a mining engineer, educated at a technical college in Pennsylvania, and he had believed he could make his fortune by applying scientific principles to the extraction of ore. He had been right, to a degree. His methods had improved productivity in several mines around Silverbrook, and he had earned enough money to begin building the hotel that his wife had always dreamed of owning. But the mountain had claimed him, as it claimed so many men. A miscalculation, a weak beam, a moment of inattention, and James Thornwood had been buried under tons of rock and earth. They had recovered his body 3 days later, broken and crushed, barely recognizable. Abigail had not cried at the funeral, had not broken down or collapsed in grief. She had stood beside the grave with her face like stone, had accepted the condolences of the townspeople with quiet dignity, and had gone home to plan her future. She had used the insurance money and her husband's savings to finish the hotel, which had been half built at the time of his death. She had overseen every detail of the construction herself, had negotiated with suppliers, had hired workers and supervised their labor. The Silver Bell had opened in 1892, and it had immediately become the centerpiece of Silverbrook's social life, the place where visiting businessmen stayed, where weddings and community gatherings were held, where anyone who wanted to feel civilized for an evening could enjoy a good meal and a comfortable bed. The hotel had 20 rooms on the second and third floors, a dining room that could seat 40 people, a lobby with a grand fireplace built from river stones, and furnishings that Abigail had imported from Denver and even San Francisco. She employed a staff of 6, including a cook, 2 housemaids, a maintenance man, and 2 young men who worked as porters and general laborers. She paid decent wages, demanded hard work and absolute honesty, and had built a reputation for running the cleanest, most respectable establishment in the San Juan Mountains. The mirror was meant to be the crowning touch, the final piece that would complete her vision. She had seen a similar mirror in a hotel in Denver and had become obsessed with acquiring one for the Silver Bell. For months, she had corresponded with dealers and importers, searching for exactly the right piece, something large and impressive, something with an ornate frame that would command attention and admiration. When the dealer in Denver finally wrote to say he had found what she was looking for, she had sent payment immediately, $300 in cash and promissory notes, a sum that represented a significant portion of her operating capital. The mirror was supposed to be the finest in Colorado, he had written, a piece with a history and provenance, something that had graced the home of a European nobleman before finding its way to America. She had never asked what nobleman, or what home, or why such a valuable piece would be sold to a dealer in Denver. She had only cared that it was beautiful, impressive, and would make her hotel the finest in the region. She had not asked questions that might have warned her, might have saved us all. We pried open the crate with crowbars, the wood splitting with sharp cracks that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. The mirror lay nestled in straw and burlap, wrapped in layers of cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age and travel. As we pulled away the wrappings, the mirror revealed itself piece by piece, and even then, even before we knew what it truly was, I felt something cold touch the base of my spine. It was a magnificent piece, I had to admit. The frame was carved from dark wood, almost black, worked into elaborate patterns of vines and flowers that seemed to writhe and twist when seen from the corner of the eye. The glass itself was large, perhaps 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and perfectly clear, without flaw or bubble. But there was something about its surface, something in the way it caught the light, that made me uneasy. It seemed too deep, as if you could fall into it and never find the bottom. We lifted it carefully and carried it to the wall opposite the main entrance, where Abigail had already arranged for hooks and supports to be installed. When we finally had it in place, she stepped back and clasped her hands together in satisfaction. That was when we first saw it. That was when we first understood that something was wrong. Marcus Chen, a young miner from California, stood directly in front of the mirror, adjusting his position to help align the frame. He was a cheerful man, always smiling, barely 25 years old, with smooth skin and bright eyes, and the kind of optimism that seemed immune to the hardships of mountain life. But when he looked into the mirror, his smile disappeared. The reflection showed a man, yes. It showed someone standing where Marcus stood, wearing the same clothes, in the same position. But the face was wrong. The face in the mirror was Marcus's face, but transformed, corrupted. The skin was gray and waxy, the eyes sunken and clouded, the mouth hanging slack in the unmistakable expression of death. The reflection showed Marcus Chen as a corpse. I will never forget the sound he made when he saw it. Not a scream exactly, more like a gasp, a sound of absolute shock and horror that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. His hand flew to his throat as if he could not breathe, and his eyes went wide with a terror I had never seen before. For a moment he seemed frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from that terrible reflection. Then he stumbled backward with a cry, his face suddenly pale, one hand reaching up to touch his own cheek as if to confirm that he was still alive, still whole. The rest of us stared at the mirror and then at Marcus, and then back at the mirror again. When he was no longer standing in front of it, the reflection showed only the empty lobby, perfectly normal, perfectly clear. The fire crackled in the fireplace. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it was, but we had all seen it. We had all seen death looking back at us from that perfect glass. Marcus backed away from the mirror, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking. He looked at each of us in turn, searching our faces for reassurance, for someone to tell him that what he had seen was impossible, a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination brought on by exhaustion or cold. But we could offer no such comfort. We had seen it too. We had all witnessed the reflection that showed him as a corpse. What was that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. What did I just see? No one answered. What could we say? That we had seen him dead in the mirror? That his reflection had shown him with the skin and eyes and expression of a corpse? It was impossible, insane, the kind of thing that happened in fever dreams or ghost stories, not in the physical world we inhabited. Ezekiel Marsh, the freight driver, laughed nervously. Bad glass, he said. Sometimes happens with cheap mirrors. Gets a distortion in the casting. Makes folks look strange. But it had not been a distortion. We had all seen it clearly. That had been death looking back at us. Abigail frowned and stepped in front of the mirror herself. For a long moment we held our breath, but her reflection appeared normal, showing a middle-aged woman in a dark dress, her face lined with worry and fatigue, but unmistakably alive. She turned her head from side to side, examining herself, and the reflection moved perfectly in sync. "Seems fine to me," she said, though her voice was uncertain. She looked at Marcus, who was still pale, still shaken. "You probably just saw yourself in poor light. The lamp oil gives everyone a sickly look sometimes." But Marcus shook his head slowly. "That wasn't poor light, Mrs. Thornwood. That was me dead. I know what I saw." I stepped in front of the mirror next, driven by a need to understand, to find a rational explanation. My reflection showed me as I was, a man of average height with brown hair going gray at the temples, wearing a shopkeeper's apron and a simple shirt. I looked tired, perhaps, and older than I felt, but I was alive, definitely alive. One by one, the other men tested the mirror. James Holbrook, the blacksmith, saw himself as he was. His massive shoulders and scarred hands reflected accurately. Samuel Petit, who ran the assay office, saw his own thin frame and spectacles without distortion. Even Ezekiel Marsh, despite his earlier nervousness, saw only his normal frost-burned face looking back. Only Marcus Chen saw death. Abigail tried to laugh it off, but the sound was forced and brittle. "A trick of the eye," she insisted. "A moment of dizziness from the cold. The mirror is fine. It's beautiful. Exactly what I wanted." But Marcus backed away from it, his eyes never leaving the glass. And when he left the hotel, he did not look back. That night, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind howled down from the peaks, carrying snow that cut like broken glass, and the town of Silverbrook huddled in on itself, every door sealed tight, every stove burning hot. I sat in my room above the general store, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. But I could not stop thinking about the mirror, about the image of Marcus Chen's corpse staring back from the glass. I told myself it meant nothing, a reflection, nothing more. Glass and silvering and light. There was no such thing as a mirror that could show the future, no such thing as a curse or prophecy captured in a frame of carved wood. These were the superstitions of ignorant people, the fears of those who could not accept the mechanical nature of the world. But I had seen Marcus's face in that mirror. I had seen death looking back. The next morning, they found him frozen in his boarding house room. The stove had gone out sometime in the night, and Marcus Chen had died in his sleep, the cold stealing his breath so gently that he had not even woken to fight it. His face was gray and waxy, his eyes sunken and clouded, his mouth hanging slack. He looked exactly as he had looked in the mirror's reflection. The town doctor, a grim man named Herbert Moss, declared it an accident. The stove had a faulty damper, he said. The room had lost its heat. In cold like this, a man could die in his sleep without ever knowing. It was tragic, but not unusual. especially in mining towns where men often lived alone in poorly built structures. But I knew the truth. The mirror had shown Marcus Chen dead because Marcus Chen was going to die. The reflection had not been a distortion or a trick of light. It had been a prophecy. I went to the Silver Bell Hotel that afternoon, pushing through wind that felt like fists, snow stinging my face. The lobby was empty except for Abigail, who sat in a chair near the fire, staring at the mirror on the opposite wall. When I entered, she did not turn to look at me. "You saw it too," she said quietly. "You saw what it showed him." I nodded, though she was not looking at me. "Yes, I've been sitting here for 3 hours," she continued, her voice hollow, "watching it, trying to understand. 6 people have come through this lobby since dawn. The mirror showed 3 of them as they are. 3 of them it showed as corpses." My blood went cold. "Which 3? She finally turned to face me, and I saw fear in her eyes, raw and unconcealed. "William Thorne, Catherine Hayes, and young Sarah Mercer. I knew these people. William Thorne was a prospector in his 50s, strong as an ox, healthy and vital. Catherine Hayes ran the boarding house where Marcus had died, a capable woman of middle years. Sarah Mercer was 16 years old, the daughter of the assayer, bright and beautiful and full of life. "When?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. Abigail shook her head. "I don't know. The mirror doesn't say when. It only shows what will be. Today, tomorrow, next week. I don't know." I stood there in the warmth of the lobby, listening to the fire crackle, looking at that beautiful, terrible mirror. The glass was perfectly clear, reflecting the room with absolute fidelity. There was no hint of supernatural power, no visible sign that this was anything other than an ordinary piece of furniture. But I could feel it now, that sense of wrongness I had experienced when we first uncrated it. The mirror was not simply showing us reflections. It was showing us fate. "We should destroy it," I said. Abigail looked at me sharply. "It cost me $300. That's half a year's profit. It's evil. It's glass and wood. It showed Marcus dead, and now Marcus is dead. It's showing 3 more people dead. How many more will it kill?" She stood up, her face hardening. "The mirror didn't kill Marcus. The cold killed Marcus. A faulty stove and bad luck. This is Colorado in January. People die. That's the nature of this place." I wanted to argue with her, to make her see reason, but I could see the stubbornness in her expression. Abigail Thornwood had not survived her husband's death and built a successful business by giving in to fear or superstition. She was a practical woman, just as I had always been a practical man. And practical people did not believe in cursed mirrors. But I had seen what I had seen. I left the hotel and went back to my store, but I could not focus on my work. I kept thinking about William Thorne, Catherine Hayes, and Sarah Mercer. 3 people going about their lives with no idea that they were marked for death. Should I warn them? And if I did, what would I say? "I saw you dead in a mirror, so you should be careful." They would think me mad. Instead, I watched. I paid attention. I looked for signs of illness or danger, anything that might explain how these 3 people might die. William Thorne came into my store that evening to buy tobacco. He looked healthy, his face ruddy from the cold, his movements confident and strong. We talked about the weather, about the price of silver, about the new tunnel being dug on the eastern ridge. There was nothing about him that suggested death was near. 2 days later, he was crushed in a mining accident when a support timber gave way. The tunnel collapsed and William Thorne was buried under 1,000 tons of rock and frozen earth. They never recovered his body. Catherine Hayes died 3 days after that. She was found at the bottom of the stairs in her boarding house, her neck broken, her body twisted at an impossible angle. The doctor said she must have slipped on ice that had formed on the wooden steps. A tragic accident. But there had been no ice. I had checked. The stairs were dry and solid. Sarah Mercer lasted a week. She developed a fever that seemed to come from nowhere, her temperature rising so fast that her skin burned to the touch. Dr. Moss tried everything, quinine and cold compresses and bleeding, but nothing worked. The girl wasted away in 3 days, her beautiful face becoming gaunt and hollow, her eyes sinking into dark circles. At the end, she did not even recognize her own father. She died calling out for her mother, who had been dead for 5 years. I visited the Mercer house on the 2nd day of Sarah's illness, bringing supplies that Samuel Mercer had requested from my store, medicines and clean linens and the other necessities of sickroom care. The house was small but well kept, a two-room structure that Samuel had built when he first arrived in Silverbrook. He had been living alone since his wife died, raising Sarah by himself, working long hours at the assay office to provide for her, dreaming of the day when she would finish school and perhaps go to college in Denver or even back east. When I arrived, I found him sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Sarah lay beneath a pile of quilts, shivering despite the heat that radiated from her body. Her skin was flushed and dry, her breathing rapid and shallow, and when she opened her eyes, they were glassy and unfocused, seeing things that were not there. "She keeps talking to her mother," Samuel whispered to me, his voice broken. "She thinks Martha is here, sitting on the other side of the bed. She's having whole conversations with her, laughing at things Martha used to say. She doesn't seem to know I'm here at all." I had no comfort to offer him. I set down the supplies I had brought and stood awkwardly in the doorway, not knowing what to say or do. Dr. Moss arrived a few minutes later, his medical bag in hand, his face grim. He examined Sarah carefully, checking her pulse and temperature, listening to her breathing. But I could see the resignation in his eyes. He had seen this before, had watched other patients succumb to fevers that came from nowhere and burned through their bodies like wildfire. There was little he could do except try to keep her comfortable and wait for the fever to break or for death to claim her. It chose death. Sarah died just before dawn on the third day of her illness. As the first gray light began to filter through the windows, Samuel was still sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, when her breathing simply stopped. One moment she was there, struggling for each breath, and the next she was gone, her body suddenly still, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Dr. Moss, who had stayed through the night, checked for a pulse and found none. He pulled the sheet up over her face and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, but said nothing. There were no words that could ease this pain. The funeral was held 2 days later, and it seemed like the entire town attended. Sarah had been well liked, a bright and kind girl who helped her father in the assay office and taught Sunday school at the Methodist church. People filled the small cemetery on the hillside above town, standing in the bitter cold to pay their respects, to sing hymns and listen to Father Corwin speak of God's mysterious ways and the promise of eternal life. But I saw the fear in their eyes, heard the whispers that passed between them when they thought no one was listening. 3 deaths in less than 2 weeks, all of people who had looked into the mirror and seen themselves as corpses. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Something was happening in Silverbrook, something unnatural and terrible, and the mirror was at the center of it. The town of Silverbrook began to whisper. 3 deaths in less than 2 weeks, all unnatural, all unexpected. Some said it was bad luck, a cruel winter, the mountain exacting its price. But others remembered the mirror, remembered what it had shown, and they began to look at the Silver Bell Hotel with suspicion and fear. Abigail refused to remove it. I went to her again, begging her to destroy the cursed thing, to burn it or bury it or throw it down a mine shaft where it could never harm anyone again. But she would not listen. "It's just a mirror," she insisted, though her voice trembled and her hands shook. "It can't kill people. It can't change fate. It only shows what is already going to happen." "Then why keep it?" I demanded. "If it only shows death, why torture ourselves with the knowledge?" She had no answer for that, but I could see it in her eyes. She kept the mirror because she was terrified of what it might show her. As long as she saw herself alive in its reflection, she knew she was safe. The mirror had become her talisman, her proof that death had not yet chosen her. But the mirror was hungry. It was not content with 3 deaths. It wanted more. Over the next week, 12 more people looked into the mirror and saw themselves as corpses, and one by one, they died. A man named Robert French was shot in a dispute over a mining claim, the bullet entering his chest exactly where the reflection had shown a black stain spreading across his shirt. A woman named Eliza Carmichael was found frozen on the road to Durango, though she had only been walking 100 yards from her house to the general store. A child named Timothy Moss, the doctor's own son, drowned in a water barrel that should have been frozen solid, but somehow remained liquid enough to kill. Robert French's death was particularly violent and seemed to confirm the mirror's prophecy with horrifying precision. He had looked into the mirror 3 days before his death, and several witnesses reported that his reflection showed him with a dark stain spreading across the left side of his chest. right over his heart. At the time, French had laughed it off, insisting he felt fine, that there must be something wrong with the mirror's silvering. But 3 days later, he got into an argument with a man named Jack Morrison over the boundaries of their adjacent claims. The argument turned physical, as such disputes often did in mining camps where the promise of wealth made men desperate and violent. Morrison pulled a pistol and fired once. The bullet struck French in the left side of his chest, entering almost exactly where the mirror had shown the stain. He died within minutes, bleeding out in the snow while Morrison stood over him, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his face slack with shock at what he had done. Morrison was arrested and locked in the small jail that Silverbrook maintained for drunks and troublemakers. He kept insisting it had been self-defense, that French had come at him with a knife, that he had only meant to scare him, not to kill. But there were witnesses who said French had been unarmed, that Morrison had drawn first, that it had been murder plain and simple. The matter would have to be settled by a judge when one could be brought up from Durango. But in the meantime, Morrison sat in his cell and stared at the walls, and occasionally we could hear him weeping. Eliza Carmichael's death was stranger and more troubling. She was a woman of 50-some years, a widow who made her living by taking in laundry and mending. She lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, kept to herself, bothered no one. On the morning of February 8th, she set out for my general store to purchase thread and needles, a journey she had made hundreds of times before. The distance was perhaps 100 yards, an easy walk even in winter conditions. She never arrived. When she did not appear by mid-morning, one of her neighbors went to check on her and found her body lying in the snow about halfway between her house and the store. She was frozen solid, her face blue-gray, her eyes open and staring. The temperature that morning had been perhaps 10 degrees above zero, cold enough to be dangerous, but not cold enough to kill someone in the time it would take to walk 100 yards. Dr. Moss examined the body and could find no explanation. There were no signs of injury, no indication of a heart attack or stroke. She had simply stopped walking, lain down in the snow, and died, as if something had reached out and stolen the life from her body, leaving behind only a frozen shell. The most heartbreaking death was young Timothy Moss. He was 7 years old, the doctor's only child, a bright boy with red hair and freckles who loved to build snow forts and pretend he was a cavalry soldier fighting Indians. His mother had died giving birth to him, and Dr. Moss had raised the boy alone, pouring all his love and hope into this one child. Timothy had looked into the mirror on February 10th, brought to the Silver Bell Hotel by his father, who was still insisting that there was a rational explanation for everything that had been happening. The doctor wanted to prove that the mirror was simply defective, that it showed distorted images because of some flaw in the glass or silvering. He had stood in front of it himself and seen his own reflection accurately, so he brought his son to demonstrate that children too would see themselves correctly. But Timothy saw himself dead. The reflection showed a small boy with water streaming from his mouth and nose, his skin pale and bloated, his red hair plastered to his skull. The boy had screamed and run from the hotel, and Dr. Moss had chased after him, trying to calm him, trying to convince him that what he had seen was not real. 2 days later, Timothy was playing in the yard behind the doctor's house. There was a water barrel there, used to collect rain and snow melt for washing. In February, it should have been frozen solid, a cylinder of ice from top to bottom. But when Timothy leaned over the edge to look inside, perhaps curious about something he thought he saw, he fell in. The water, which somehow remained liquid despite the freezing temperatures, closed over his head. His legs kicked for a moment, visible above the rim of the barrel, and then he was gone. Dr. Moss found him minutes later, pulled his son's body from the water, and tried desperately to revive him, pressing on his small chest, breathing air into his lungs, refusing to accept what had happened. But Timothy was dead, drowned in a barrel that should have been frozen, killed by water that should not have been liquid, exactly as the mirror had shown. After that, Dr. Moss stopped insisting on rational explanations. After that, he became the mirror's most vocal opponent, the man who walked through the streets of Silverbrook warning anyone who would listen to stay away from the Silver Bell Hotel, to never look into the cursed glass, to leave town if they could and never return. His grief transformed into rage, and his rage found a target in that perfect, terrible mirror. The deaths came faster now, as if the mirror was accelerating, as if it was feeding on the fear and grief that saturated the town. People began to avoid the Silver Bell Hotel entirely. crossing to the other side of the street rather than pass too close to its doors. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and fear is not always enough to overcome it. Some people still went inside, still stood before the mirror, still looked to see what it would show them. Most saw themselves alive, but not all. I watched the town unravel. Men began to drink more heavily, seeking oblivion in whiskey and laudanum. Women wept in their homes, clutching their children close, whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have abandoned this frozen corner of the world. The mine operation slowed as workers refused to go underground, terrified that they might be the next to see their death reflected in that terrible glass. Father Benedict Corwin, the Catholic priest who served Silverbrook and 3 other mountain towns, arrived in late February. He was an old man, nearly 70, with white hair and a face carved by decades of hard living and harder faith. He had heard rumors of the cursed mirror, stories carried down the mountain by traders and freight drivers, and he had come to investigate. I met him at my store and told him everything. I expected skepticism, perhaps even scorn, but Father Corwin only nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I have seen such things before," he said in his quiet, accented voice. He had been born in Ireland, and the old country still colored his speech. Objects that become vessels for darkness. Mirrors are particularly susceptible. They exist between 2 states, showing what is here and also what is there. Sometimes that boundary becomes permeable. Sometimes things from the other side can look through. "What things?" I asked. He was silent for a long moment. "Demons, some would say. Angels of death. Others might call them manifestations of fate itself. The names do not matter. What matters is that this mirror has become a window into the moment of death, and by showing people their end, it may be drawing them toward it. Prophecy has power. Knowledge of death can create death. Can you stop it?" He looked at me with eyes that were tired and sad and infinitely patient. "I can try. I can perform an exorcism, bless the mirror, attempt to sever whatever connection it has formed with the realm of death. But I will need Mrs. Thornwood's permission. It is her property." Abigail refused. I was there when Father Corwin went to the Silver Bell Hotel to speak with her. The lobby was empty, the fire burning low, and Abigail sat in her usual chair, staring at the mirror. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in the past month. Her hair was coming loose from its bun. Her dress was rumpled, and her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. "Mrs. Thornwood," Father Corwin said gently, "I have come to help. This mirror is not a natural thing. It has been corrupted, perhaps cursed. I can cleanse it, make it safe." She shook her head slowly. "You want to take it away?" "I want to save lives. It doesn't kill anyone," she whispered. "It only shows the truth, and the truth is that we all die. Every one of us. The mirror just shows us when." Father Corwin knelt beside her chair, his old knees cracking with the effort. "My child, we are not meant to know the hour of our death. That knowledge is God's alone. This mirror is showing you things that no human should see, and that knowledge is destroying your town. Please, let me help." For a moment I thought she would agree. I saw her waver, saw doubt flicker across her face. But then she looked up at the mirror, at her own reflection showing her alive and whole, and she shook her head again. "No, it stays. I need it to stay." Father Corwin stood slowly, his face filled with sorrow. "Then I will pray for you, Mrs. Thornwood, and I will pray for everyone in Silverbrook. But I fear my prayers will not be enough." He left the next morning, heading back down the mountain toward Durango. I watched him go and felt something inside me break. If a priest could not save us, then what hope did we have? The answer, I realized, was none. We had no hope. The mirror would continue to show death, and death would continue to come, and one by one we would all fall until Silverbrook was nothing but a ghost town, haunted by the memory of its own destruction, unless someone had the courage to destroy it. I began to plan. The mirror was large and heavy, but glass could be broken. Wood could be burned. If I could get into the hotel at night when Abigail was asleep, I could smash the cursed thing to pieces and end its reign of terror. I would face her anger, perhaps even legal consequences, but I would save the town. But I was not the only one who had that idea. On the night of March 3rd, someone set fire to the Silver Bell Hotel. I was woken by the sound of bells ringing, the alarm that meant fire, the most terrifying thing that could happen in a town built entirely of wood and located miles from any real source of water. I threw on my clothes and ran into the street, joining dozens of other people converging on the hotel where flames were already roaring from the first-floor windows. The bucket brigade formed quickly, men and women passing pails of water from the pump to the fire. But it was clear from the start that the hotel was lost. The flames were too hot, too fast, spreading with unnatural speed through the dry timber. Within minutes, the entire building was engulfed, the fire reaching so high into the night sky that it seemed to challenge the stars themselves. Abigail Thornwood stood in the street, watching her life's work burn. Her face was slack with shock, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she made no sound. She simply stood there, frozen, as if she too had become a reflection in a cursed mirror. And then, as the roof collapsed and sparks fountained into the darkness, I saw something that made my blood freeze colder than any winter wind. The mirror was still standing. Through the flames and smoke, visible in the burning lobby, the mirror remained intact. The frame was not blackening. The glass was not cracking. It stood there perfect and whole, reflecting the fire, reflecting the chaos, and in its surface I could see shapes moving, human forms that were not part of the crowd watching the blaze. I could see the dead. Marcus Chen stood in the mirror's reflection, his corpse face turned toward us, his clouded eyes watching. Beside him was William Thorne, his body crushed and broken. Catherine Hayes was there, with her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Sarah Mercer, her face gaunt with fever. Robert French with his chest torn open by a bullet. All of them standing in the mirror. All of them watching us burn their killer. The hotel collapsed completely around midnight, the walls falling inward with a roar that shook the ground beneath our feet. The heat was so intense that we had to back away, shielding our faces with our arms. And when the flames finally died down to smoldering embers and the smoke began to clear, we saw what remained. The mirror stood in the center of the ruins, completely undamaged. Not a scratch on the glass, not a scorch mark on the frame. It rose from the ashes like a monument, like a gravestone, still reflecting, still showing us things we did not want to see. No one wanted to approach it. We all stood in the street, staring at that impossible survival. And I think we all understood at that moment that we were dealing with something beyond our comprehension, something that could not be destroyed by fire or any other physical means. Dr. Moss stepped forward finally, his medical bag in his hand, his face set with determination. He was a man of science, a rationalist who believed in causes and effects, in diagnoses and treatments. He did not believe in curses or demons or cursed mirrors. He walked toward the ruins, toward the mirror, and we watched him go with a mixture of hope and dread. He stopped a few feet from the mirror and looked into it. For a long moment he was still, his face illuminated by the dying embers. Then he stumbled backward, his bag falling from his hand, his mouth opening in a silent scream. He ran. Dr. Herbert Moss, who had faced disease and death and the worst that frontier medicine could offer, ran through the streets of Silverbrook like a man pursued by demons, and we heard him screaming all the way to his house. In the morning, they found him hanging from a rafter in his barn. He had used his own medical equipment, fashioning a noose with practiced efficiency, and he had left no note. But we all knew why. We all understood. The mirror had shown him his death, and rather than wait for it to come, he had chosen to meet it on his own terms. The town council met that afternoon in emergency session. There were 7 councilmen, and I was one of them. We gathered in the back room of my general store, away from prying eyes and listening ears, and we faced the truth we had been avoiding. Silverbrook was cursed. The mirror had brought death to our town, and it would not stop until we were all gone. Every person who looked into it risked seeing their own demise, and the knowledge of that death seemed to draw it closer, to make it inevitable. "We have to leave," said James Holbrook, the blacksmith. "Abandon the town. Go down to Durango or over to Telluride. Start fresh somewhere else." "And leave that thing standing?" demanded Samuel Petit. "Leave it here for the next group of poor souls who decide to build on this site. We have a responsibility." "To do what?" Holbrook shot back. "It survived the fire. It can't be destroyed. What are we supposed to do? Throw a canvas over it and hope no one ever finds it?" They argued for an hour, their voices rising and falling, fear and anger and desperation mixing into a toxic brew. But in the end, we all knew there was only one solution. Someone had to look into the mirror one last time and see if there was a way to end this. I volunteered. I was not brave. I was terrified. But I was also tired of being afraid. Tired of watching my town die one person at a time. tired of feeling powerless against something I could not understand or fight. If the mirror wanted to show me my death, then so be it. At least I would die knowing I had tried. We walked to the ruins of the Silver Bell Hotel at sunset, all 7 councilmen together, walking in silence through streets that had become nearly empty as people barricaded themselves in their homes. The mirror stood waiting, the last light of day reflecting off its perfect surface, turning it into a sheet of red and gold. I approached it alone. The others stayed back, watching from a safe distance. My footsteps crunched on broken glass and charred wood, and the smell of smoke was thick in the air. The mirror grew larger as I approached, until it filled my vision, until there was nothing in the world except that smooth glass and my own reflection walking toward it. I stopped directly in front of it and looked into my own eyes. For a moment, I saw myself as I was. Thomas Brennan, shopkeeper, councilman, a man of 32 years with brown hair going gray, and eyes that had seen too much death. I was alive. I was whole. I was still here. And then the reflection changed. I saw myself old, my hair completely white, my face lined with deep wrinkles. I was sitting in a chair by a window, sunlight streaming in, a book open in my lap. I looked peaceful. I looked content. And I was definitely, absolutely dead. My chest was not moving. My eyes were fixed and glassy. I was a corpse sitting in a chair, bathed in sunlight, a book of poetry open to a page I would never finish reading. But there was something else in the reflection, something I almost missed because I was so focused on the image of my own death. Behind my corpse, in the background of the scene, I could see a landscape, trees, a lake, mountains in the distance, and in the far corner of the reflection, partially obscured by the frame, I could see a gravestone. I leaned closer, trying to read the inscription on that stone, and the mirror's reflection shifted slightly, as if accommodating my curiosity. The words became clear, carved into weathered granite. Thomas Brennan, 1863-1934, beloved husband and father. He lived to see his grandchildren grow, 1863 to 1934. That would make me 71 years old. The mirror was showing me my death, yes, but it was showing me dying of old age, peacefully, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived. I would have a wife, children, grandchildren, decades of life still ahead of me. I had expected to see myself dead tomorrow, or next week, or next month. I had expected to see violence or disease or accident, but the mirror was showing me something else entirely. It was showing me that if I left this place, if I survived, I would live a long and full life. And in that moment, I understood. The mirror did not cause death. It only showed what would happen. Marcus Chen had died because his stove was faulty and the cold was merciless. The others had died because of accidents, coincidences, the random cruelty of a dangerous world. The mirror had not killed them. It had only known. But the knowledge itself was dangerous. Knowing you would die could paralyze you with fear, could drive you to reckless actions or desperate choices. Dr. Moss had seen his death and chosen to claim it himself rather than wait in terror. Others might try to change their fate and only hurry it along. The mirror showed truth, but truth without context was a weapon. I stepped back from the glass and turned to face the other councilman. "Cover it," I said. "Don't destroy it because you can't. Don't look into it because you don't want to know. Just cover it with canvas and boards and bury it under the ruins. Build something else here, something new. Let the mirror sleep under stone and timber, and maybe someday, when we're all long dead, someone will be wise enough to understand what it really is." We spent the next 3 days doing exactly that. We built a wooden box around the mirror, then filled the ruins of the hotel with stone and earth until the mirror was buried under 10 feet of rubble. We erected a new building on the site, a community hall, and we swore an oath among ourselves never to speak of what lay beneath it. Silverbrook survived. The deaths stopped. People slowly began to emerge from their homes, to resume their lives, to work the mines and raise their children and build a future in that hard, beautiful place. Some families left, unwilling to stay in a town that had seen so much death, but most remained, because they had nowhere else to go and no other way to earn their living. I stayed for another 2 years, running my general store, serving on the town council, trying to forget about the mirror buried beneath the community hall, but I could not forget. Every time I walked past that building, I felt the weight of it, the knowledge of what slept below. and I knew that someday, somehow, it would be uncovered again. In 1897, I sold my store and left Silverbrook. I moved to Denver, then eventually to Kansas, where I met a woman named Elizabeth who had no interest in mining towns or mountain winters. We married in 1899 and had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. I became a shopkeeper again, this time in a small prairie town where the worst dangers were drought and locusts, where no cursed mirrors lurked beneath community halls. I never went back to Silverbrook. I read about it occasionally in newspapers, learned that it had thrived for a time, that the mines had produced good silver, that the town had grown to nearly 1,000 people. But then the silver ran out, as silver always does, and people began to leave. By 1910, Silverbrook was nearly abandoned. By 1920, it was a ghost town, the buildings falling into ruin, the mines sealed and forgotten. I wonder sometimes if the mirror is still there, buried under the collapsed remains of the community hall, waiting in darkness for someone to find it. I wonder if it still shows the future, still reflects death instead of life. I wonder if it hungers for the light, for eyes to look into it, for more lives to observe marching toward their inevitable end. I am 71 years old now, and I know my time is short. I can feel it in my bones, in the way my breath comes harder each morning, in the exhaustion that never quite leaves me. I have lived to see my grandchildren grow, just as the mirror showed me I would. The reflection was true. The prophecy was accurate. But I've also lived a full life, a good life, because I chose to leave that cursed place and make my own future. The mirror showed me what would be, but it did not force me to walk a particular path. I had the freedom to choose, to build, to love, and be loved in return. That is the real curse of the mirror, I think. Not that it shows death, because we all die eventually. The real curse is that it makes people believe they have no control, no choice, no agency in their own lives. It makes them think that fate is fixed and immutable, that knowing the future means surrendering to it. But we are not slaves to what will be. We are creators of what might be. And even when we know how the story ends, we still have the power to write the chapters that come before. I am writing this account in the spring of 1934, sitting in a chair by a window in my daughter's house, sunlight streaming through the glass, warming my old bones. I have a book of poetry open in my lap, verses by Whitman that speak of grass and death and the eternal cycle of life. I am at peace. I am ready. And if somewhere in the ruins of Silverbrook, Colorado, buried under stone and rotting timber, a mirror still stands with its perfect glass reflecting an empty darkness, showing an endless parade of deaths to an audience of ghosts and memory, then I hope it remains buried forever. I hope no one ever finds it. I hope the knowledge it offers dies with that abandoned town, lost to the snow and the wind and the passage of time, because some reflections should never be seen. Some knowledge should never be gained. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. The mirror showed me truth, but it could not show me wisdom. And wisdom, I have learned, is knowing when not to look. I close my eyes now as the sun sets over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. My breathing slows. My heart beats its final measures. And I die as the mirror showed me I would, 71 years old, peaceful and content, with my grandchildren's laughter echoing from the next room. But I die free. I die knowing that I chose this path, that I wrote this ending, that the reflection in the cursed glass was only a possibility I happened to fulfill by living well and refusing to be afraid. The mirror could show the future, but it could never take away the present, and the present, every moment of it, belonged to me. That is what I learned in Silverbrook. That is what I want people to know if anyone ever reads these words, if anyone ever finds the story of the mirror that reflected tomorrow's dead instead of today's living. You will die. That is certain. The mirror could show you when and how, could give you the terrible knowledge of your own end. But that knowledge would not change what matters. What matters is the living. What matters is the choice. What matters is understanding that even if you know the destination, you still get to decide the journey. I learned that lesson at a terrible price, watching good people die in a frozen mountain town, watching fear and knowledge and prophecy tear a community apart. But I learned it nonetheless, and I lived my life according to that wisdom. The mirror is still out there, I suppose, waiting, showing its terrible truths to the darkness and the silence. But I am here, in the light, in the warmth, in the love of my family. And when my granddaughter finds this journal years from now, when she reads about the cursed mirror and the deaths in Silverbrook and her grandfather's long journey from fear to peace, I hope she understands. I hope she knows that I died grateful, not for the knowledge of my death, but for the ignorance of so many things that allowed me to live freely. Some mirrors should remain covered. Some questions should stay unasked. Some reflections are better left in darkness. And the frontier between life and death, between knowing and not knowing, between what is and what will be, should remain uncrossed, unexplored, sacred and terrible, and forever beyond our reach. That is my testimony. That is my warning. That is my gift to whoever finds these words. Live well, choose freely, and never, never look into a mirror that shows you more than you should see. The sun has set now. The room is growing dark. My daughter is calling my name from somewhere distant, her voice filled with concern, but I cannot answer. My time has come, exactly as it was shown, exactly as it was always going to be. I am Thomas Brennan. I was there when the mirror came to Silverbrook. I survived when so many others did not, and I am dying now, 71 years old, having lived to see my grandchildren grow. The mirror was right, but I was free, and that makes all the difference.